Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the second installment of the Evolution of Mindfulness speaker series, where today we will be discussing well-being as a skill, neuroscience for a healthier mind. It's truly an honor to be here with you all today as we continue this exploration into mindfulness, a practice that has ancient roots but continues to shape modern science, healthcare, education, and daily life. For those who are new to the series, my name is Frances Sadi, and I am the Associate Director of Non-Degree Programs here at Brown University's School of Professional Studies, where we are proud to offer an ever-expanding portfolio of evidence-based mindfulness programs, which consists of short classes, teacher training certificates, as well as free master classes such as the talk today. At Brown, we are deeply committed to advancing education that is both intellectually rigorous, but also personally transformative. Our mindfulness programs, developed in collaboration with the Mindfulness Center at the Brown University School of Public Health, embody this mission, integrating scientific research, contemplative traditions, and practical application to make mindfulness accessible and impactful in a wide range of settings. So I am delighted to welcome you into this space today, a moment in time where we can pause, reflect, and engage around the latest research on mindfulness. Our intention behind the Evolution of Mindfulness speaker series is to explore the dynamic intersection of mindfulness, neuroscience, and human well-being, bringing together thought leaders who are shaping the future of this ever-changing, evolving field. So in our first session, we heard from MBSR founder and mindfulness legend Jon Kabat-Zinn, where together we reflected on the foundations of modern mindfulness and on how contemplative traditions have shaped today's mindfulness-based interventions, teacher training programs, and have been integrated into modern therapeutic and professional settings. If you missed that talk, no worries. You can find a recording of it on our YouTube channel. Today, we are shifting our focus towards the science of mindfulness and on how decades of research in neuroscience, psychology, behavioral health, and medicine continue to deepen our understanding of the mechanisms and effects of mindfulness on the mind, brain, and overall health. The idea that mindfulness can actually change our brain was once groundbreaking. Today, it is a widely accepted and actively researched field, showing us that mindfulness is not just a state of mind, that it's actually a practice that can rewire neural pathways, strengthen emotional resilience, and even support overall health. To help us navigate the conversation, I am thrilled to once again be joined by Dr. Eric Laux. Eric is the founder and director of the Mindfulness Center here at Brown University, where he leads cutting-edge research on the science of mindfulness and its impact on health. His work, alongside the groundbreaking studies coming from the Mindfulness Center, is helping to establish mindfulness as a key component of evidence-based healthcare. And of course, we are honored to welcome today's special guest, Dr. Richard Davidson. Dr. Davidson is a world-renowned neuroscientist and the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His pioneering research has helped to uncover how mindfulness affects brain function, emotional regulation, and overall well-being, shaping how we understand and apply mindfulness in clinical and everyday settings. Before we dive into today's discussion, I want to just address a few quick housekeeping notes. So first, we are recording today's webinar, and we will make sure to send out a link, as we did last time, to the recording later this week, along with some additional resources on the programs offered here at Brown. You can also find the recording of this talk and others in the speaker series on our Brown Mindfulness YouTube channel. Second, we really invite you to fully engage with today's talk, whether that means taking notes, reflecting on what resonates with you, or simply just listening deeply. So if you have questions, please do use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We do have our chat disabled for this talk, but you can submit questions and comments through the Q&A feature. We do hope to leave time for some live questions, but do know that we have a large number of attendees today. So even if your question is not addressed specifically today, do know that we will read all of the questions and comments after the talk to get a sense of what is being said and what questions and themes are emerging. Lastly, we want to acknowledge that today's conversation is just really a glimpse into the vast and evolving world of mindfulness research. While we can only scratch the surface of this session, our hope is that it sparks new insights, curiosity, and deeper engagement. And with that, it is my great honor to welcome you, Richie Davidson, Dr. Davidson, and Dr. Eric Laux. Thank you both for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So yeah, really happy to be engaging with you in conversation today, Richie. I know we gave an option of you to provide a talk or to engage in conversation. You opted for the conversation side of things. So I know we've had a number of opportunities to talk over the years, but I don't know if we've ever had a 1 hour one-on-one. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I think just in terms of a bit more of an introduction for you, obviously like you've published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, multiple books. You've been elected to the National Academy of Medicine. You've been named by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. But really, personally, I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about you is that you have a remarkable skill to ask really important, really innovative questions, but you also have high quality methods to answer those questions, along with the ability to inspire multitudes of young researchers and people around the world. And I include myself in one of those people who's been inspired by you. So I really appreciate you joining us today. I think you play a really important role in the field as a source of ideas and inspiration, and look forward to continuing that in our conversation today for our over 700 or about 700 people that are here live, along with all the people that will be watching it afterwards too. So really, really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for the very kind words. And it really is an honor to be here. And I want to also just acknowledge and thank you, Eric, for all the wonderful work you're doing and for creating the center at Brown, which is an important beacon for research in this area.
Thanks. It's a pleasure. With the talk title today, part of the talk title was Well-being is a Skill. And why don't you share a little about what you mean by that?
Well, this is a kind of slogan in one sense. It's also a succinct summary in another sense of probably 30 years of research. I think it needs to be presented in the right spirit, but it is meant to invite us to embrace the idea that every human being is born into the world with the capacity to flourish. But just as many other capacities, in order for that capacity to be expressed, it needs to be nurtured. And well-being is one of those capacities that our findings and the findings of many other scientists show can actually be nurtured. And so we think that this is something really important. It kind of democratizes well-being, if you will. It's not something that is just seen in certain groups and not others. It really is a quality that every human being can improve with the right conditions and circumstances and exercises, if you will, skill-based practices. So That is really what we mean by it. And what we also mean by it, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is that while the skills include mindfulness, we believe they also include other qualities that are equally important.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I know that's something I've heard you share, but we've talked a little bit about it in the past too, around, you know, just like the importance of mindfulness itself, and is it enough? Like, or are we at the phase at this point now with all these different wisdom traditions out there in the world to build it out even farther? And I'm curious your thoughts about that, and if you feel like there's particularly promising areas of wisdom or contemplative practices that you feel like could really show benefit.
Well, now may be an opportune moment to very briefly introduce the framework for understanding the plasticity of well-being that we've developed in our center, which forms the foundation for a lot of the work we're doing these days. And the framework holds that there are four key pillars of well-being. The first pillar we call awareness, and awareness is where we would place mindfulness. It includes our capacity to become self-aware. It also includes our capacity for meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is the capacity to know what our mind is doing. And so that's the first pillar, but there are three others. The second is connection, and connection is our um, uh, uh, capacity um, to cultivate qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. And I should say that each of these pillars we know is instantiated in particular brain networks, and all of these brain networks exhibit plasticity. So we know that these are networks that can be shaped by experience, and they're also networks that can be trained through specific practices. So the second is connection. The third pillar we call insight. And insight is a curiosity-driven self-knowledge. And so it's literally the experiential understanding that our thoughts and our beliefs and our expectations of ourselves literally shape how we experience the world. And what's important for well-being is not so much changing the narrative, which we all have, but rather changing our relationship to this narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, which is a constellation of thoughts and beliefs and expectations. And finally, the last pillar is purpose. And purpose is about finding our sense of direction in our life. It's not so much about finding something more purposeful to do with our lives, but how can we find meaning and purpose in even the most pedestrian activities of daily living? Can taking out the garbage be deeply connected to our sense of purpose? And the answer is, of course it could be. It just requires a little bit of reframing, and that's something that can easily be taught. And so each of these pillars is critical for well-being, and to privilege one over the other is misguided, we think. All four are important, and they all are synergistic. And if you just cultivated one to the exclusion of the other three, it would be like going to the gym and just working out on your upper body. It'd be good for your upper body, but after a while, it can actually lead to some imbalance. So we believe that all of these are important, and together they can produce optimal human flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the app that your team developed, the Healthy Minds program, and how it's organized around those four different pillars. And be curious to hear more, like, how did you come up with those four? Like, are they grounded in ancient contemplative wisdom, or are they grounded in science, or did you do some sort of factor analysis to like boil them down to these four active components? Like, how did you come up with those four?
It's a great question, Eric. And it was a process of sifting and winnowing to identify the conjunction between what we know from modern science and what we know from the ancient contemplative traditions, particularly the Buddhist contemplative tradition. And so we wanted to come up with that overlapping portion of the Venn diagrams that cross these two great approaches to understanding the world. It was really through this process of sifting and winnowing that we identified these four. And I should point out that when you look at research on the science of well-being, you will recognize that two of our pillars are found in virtually every other framework for understanding well-being. And those two pillars are connection and purpose. And two of our pillars are really unique and don't show up, to the best of our knowledge, pretty much in any other framework for understanding well-being, and that is awareness and insight. And
Yeah.
those especially are ones that were it not for the contemplative traditions, I don't think we would have included them, at least initially, in this kind of framework.
Yeah. 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 Thinking about I'm obviously interested in cardiovascular health, and think about, like, say, diet and physical activity, how they not only influence physical health, but also mental well-being too. The kinds of foods that we eat can influence our mental well-being as well as our physical activity. And I'm curious, like, do you see those fitting into these pillars in particular ways? I'd be curious to hear more around like some of those elements and how they would come in.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think that there are factors that can influence all of these pillars. Um, we know that physical exercise is probably the most empirically well-validated non-pharmacological strategy to actually increase neuroplasticity. Um, and so, I do think that that's super important, but I should also quickly point out that increasing neuroplasticity in and of itself is neutral. If you increase neuroplasticity and your mind is filled with toxic thoughts and unwholesome emotions, it'll actually make things worse. Um, and so if you're engaging in physical exercise and watching, gunk on television, it's probably a really bad combination. Um, one really interesting question is, how might we optimally combine these? We've been thinking locally about contemplative aerobics and trying to actually figure out how to do this in a way that makes sense. Um, so there's there's a lot of research opportunity in that area. With respect to food and diet, there's no question that what we eat affects our brain. I don't think that there's any good evidence to suggest that it affects one pillar more than other pillars, but it probably modulates brain systems that impact all these different pillars. We know that there are 200 million neurons in the gut, and we know that the microbiome, for example, massively influences brain function and vice versa. So there's bidirectional communication. And actually, in some of our very recent work, we are looking at relations between changes in the microbiome and changes in the mind and brain and their reciprocal interaction. So there's a lot more to be unpacked there.
Mhm. Yeah, I almost think of it like the pillar of awareness. So the awareness of how physical activity and diet make us feel, for example, health-wise, but also the insight that can come when we're eating certain kinds of foods or getting certain kinds of activities, how that influences our well-being too. So I almost think of those two as particularly synergistic with some of those elements, but I could see it fitting into many with the other two pillars, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, but still there.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting reflection. I think a lot depends on the context. We often eat in the presence of others. We often encourage people to do little micro practices around eating that involve appreciation for all the people it took to have food on your plate, which really then becomes very much a connection practice. And so, I think that um, uh, there are a lot of possibilities and opportunities there.
Just to shift gears a little bit, I know that you have been friends and colleagues with the Dalai Lama for decades, and be curious to hear a little more about your relationship with him.
Yeah, so I appreciate you asking. I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1992. And those were really early days. And at that time, I was what I often have referred to as a closet meditator. I was meditating in my personal life, but I really had not brought it into my professional life in any major way, although I tried very early on in my career, but I would say that I was quite unsuccessful. In part because the zeitgeist was simply unreceptive. But when I first met the Dalai Lama, he really encouraged me to come out of the closet. And then a few years after I first met him in another meeting, he was more emphatic and he held my arm and he said, I want you to take the practices from our tradition, turn them into a form that is more secular, that anyone would feel comfortable practicing, investigate them with the tools of modern science, and if you find them to be valuable, disseminate them widely. And I take this to be my assignment for the remainder of my time on the planet. And the Dalai Lama has been deeply impactful in my life, both my professional and my personal life. He's influenced my own personal meditation practice. And I've been honored and privileged to be able to see him, at least once a year since I met him, often many more times than once a year. And so I saw him last just a few months ago at his residence in India. And so, he'll be turning 90 soon. And we're just very fortunate to still have him with us, guiding us and inspiring us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the questions that we're asking each of the speakers in this series is, how did you, what first led you to mindfulness? So even before meeting the Dalai Lama, what first led you to begin like a meditation practice, for example?
Well, it's a really important question. And this will relate to your first founding speaker and founding um, uh, um, leader, uh, and that is John Kabat-Zinn. Uh, and others, but I was fortunate to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the early 1970s. This was before John developed MBSR. And what inspired me to practice meditation, honestly, was the demeanor of people I was meeting uh, who were infectious to me. They were wonderful people. And John was one of them. And another one at the time was Dan Goleman.
Mhm.
And they were both hanging around Cambridge at the time. And They just were, really amazing people, and I wanted to learn more about their secret sauce. And one of the first people to really teach me meditation was John Kabat-Zinn on my living room floor in Cambridge, Massachusetts in
Mm.
1972. Uh, and so I'm, deeply grateful for that inspiration in the early part of my life. And what's kind of remarkable is that both with John and with Dan Goleman, our lives are still very much interconnected, 50 years later, more than 50 years later. It's kind of really just an extraordinary blessing. And I consider both of them to be very, very close Dharma brothers to me. Uh, and it's a very special relationship because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I often get asked, how do I convince like my spouse to meditate more or my kid to meditate more? And Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh once shared, if you're interested in sharing mindfulness, the best way to do that is to practice it ourselves.
Absolutely.
And then when people see how we've shifted and transformed and ask us what happened, that's the time to share it. And
Exactly.
so it sounds like you being in the presence of folks like John or Daniel Goleman and seeing what is it about these people, what kind of opened you up in a way
Yeah.
to then
So,
really bring it on yourself. And yeah, I've been thinking, we've had so many like really wise people in the world, like the Dalai Lama or Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa or Thich Nhat Hanh or John Kabat-Zinn, Desmond Tutu, for example. And a number of them have passed on or, are kind of slowing down with their teaching. And I'm curious, who do you see as the next generation of people who can guide wisdom at this moment in history? Who are you excited about these days as, the world's going through all these different changing times, and often we look to these touchstones of people who can offer wisdom applied right now. And who do you see as the next generation of people who can guide that?
yeah, it's a wonderful question. And, let me begin to answer that by saying that I think it's important for anyone who's trying to answer that question to recognize that our worlds, the world of any individual, is going to be quite limited. And I have the conviction that there are probably quite a few of those people on the planet that I don't know, and that we might not know. They may not be in our immediate circles, but they are playing an important role in inspiring people who they are connected with. And so that's just to acknowledge that at the outset. I'm more familiar with a particular world, and it's a world that is more explicitly in the Buddhist tradition. And my meditation teacher is Mingyur Rinpoche, and I have learned an enormous amount from him and continue to learn an enormous amount from him. And when I first started spending time with him, really a significant time was um, beginning around 2002. And I had already been meditating then, really daily, and gone to lots of meditation retreats for 25 years. And I realized I did not know anything. Um, and that was a humbling experience. And so that's when I recognized that here's someone that, I really have a lot to learn from. And so that's been wonderful. And there are others in that tradition that I think are also really remarkable. One of the ones who is taking a real interest in engaging with scientists is a woman, yogini named Kandrala. Some of you may have heard of her. Um, she's just beginning to come to the West now. She is primarily based in Nepal and Dharamsala. She also has served as an oracle for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And she's a very remarkable person. Up until roughly the age of 16, she was completely illiterate. She couldn't read or write. She came from a peasant Tibetan family. And she has just this remarkable demeanor and a deep interest in engaging with scientists. And so I think she's going to be someone that'll be on the scene in very interesting ways, really provocative ways, and challenging some of the simplistic ideas that are often part of our kind of hegemony as Western scientists. So I think that, there's going to be some exciting opportunities in the future. But then, there are some Sufi practitioners who I just sort of barely have a little scratched the surface with, who I think are also extraordinary, and they're going to be, I think, the opportunities to engage with other traditions and learn from them is going to be really important as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up some of those people. I'm not aware of them, so appreciate that. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. We had over 100 submitted ahead of time, and then I know we've got a number submitted now that are being synthesized. But one of the questions was, how can mindfulness help individuals navigate uncertainty and change in a way that fosters resilience and adaptability? So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, particularly in light of the unique historical moment in which we all find ourselves with, uncertainty being kind of a dominant theme in our lives. And I think that, one of the, from the work that we do, one of the key pillars which really helps with cognitive and emotional flexibility is insight. And insight really is about not being sticky, cognitively and emotionally. And let me just try to flesh that out a little bit. I consider myself a lifelong student of emotion. I've done a lot of basic research on affective neuroscience, and the emotional life of the Dalai Lama has always interested me as a student of emotion. And one of the characteristics of his emotional life is that he has the greatest dynamic range of emotion of any human being I've ever met, with the possible exception of Kandrala, who was this woman yogini that I was describing. And what I mean by that is that he can go from crying. I mean, I've seen this myself, where he cries in response to hearing about a tragedy. And then the next moment, he could be laughing at some funny gesture or characteristic. There's complete fluidity of emotion. Now, we know that in infants can show a transition from crying to laughing or laughing to crying pretty quickly, but most adults have lost that fluidity. And the Dalai Lama has it. Andrula has it. It's a kind of remarkable fluidity. And anyone who has the misguided sense that, that meditation creates emotional zombies just needs to look at these people who've meditated more than probably almost any other human being on the planet. And their emotions are all over the place, but they show this remarkable context appropriateness of emotion. So they show strong emotion, but it comes right back down to baseline, if you will. It's just very dynamic and very context appropriate.
Mm.
This is a kind of emotional flexibility, and there's a parallel with cognitive flexibility, not being stuck in a cognitive rut, that I think really comes from this pillar of insight, which is not being identified with the narrative that we have in our minds. We all have a narrative. This is what human minds do. It's not about getting rid of the narrative. That's not possible. But it's completely changing our relationship to this narrative.
Wonderful. Yeah, I sometimes think of like that training around equanimity. And so what you're sharing there is almost incredible fluidity, but context-specific emotion, but still present and grounded.
Still present and grounded, but wildly emotional.
Yeah, I like that. We had a question come in just now from Dharmendra, who asks, what are your thoughts on tailored artificial intelligence assistive applications for the general population and certain populations, such as with older adults with cognitive impairment, to help further expand the reach and positive impacts of mindfulness? I know this is like fast moving area right now, but be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it is a fast moving area, and I think the jury is still out on this, and I am agnostic about it at this point in time and cautious, I would say. I think that there is a really, I mean, I think one of the things that the current explosion of interest in AI is doing is to sharpen our understanding of what unique human intelligence might be. What is unique about the human repertoire, if you will. And I do think that our minds are embodied. I think the role of the body in intelligence is extraordinarily important. And AIs don't have bodies. And because of that, it's a kind of skewed intelligence, if you will. Now, that might be beneficial in certain contexts for certain people under certain circumstances. And I think that what we really need to figure out is where those opportunities are, where you can judiciously apply AI in a cost-effective way that can be beneficial without succumbing to the hype and overgeneralizing.
Yeah. Are you following Neuralink much, like Elon Musk's company, where they're starting to be able to create neural networks within the body, but also tied into technology and artificial intelligence to actually
I
shift?
mean, what I understand about Neuralink is what they're doing is actually not novel at all. It's been around for at least a decade in various forms, and it's basically the opportunity to have a direct computer brain link to help facilitate functional activity in patients with explicit brain damage. Um, and I mean, I think that that's what at least the initial work of Neuralink is doing. That's been around. It's not novel. Certainly the methods have improved, and certainly it's a worthy goal. I mean, if a person can't talk, for example, because of a specific kind of brain damage, and you can facilitate their communication with a direct brain-computer link, I think that's something that can certainly be beneficial in a patient who's blind because of peripheral retinopathy, for example, being able to use artificial means to encode light signals and then have that project directly into the brain and train the brain to recognize that. That would be, those are great opportunities. So, and there's, huge amount of technical work that I think is being done that I think can really be beneficial to very specific kinds of patients. But I don't see this as anything that will be of general use to people who don't have explicit brain damage.
Okay. Yeah, it's helpful to hear. I mean, I'm curious, one of the things I've really appreciated about you over the years is just posing, open areas for inquiry that really need answers. And, I'm curious to hear a little more about, like, what do you think are the greatest scientific questions that remain unanswered or not well enough understood at this moment in history?
So, thank you for asking that. I would say probably the greatest question in that's relevant to the kind of work I do that has no satisfying answer is a question that I think would be helpful for neuroscientists to really let this question bother them more. And that is, how does subjective experience arise from the material matter of the brain? And I would say, despite the unbelievable progress of neuroscience over the last 100 years, I don't think we're one smidgen closer to answering that question, if we're really honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think that's, the great unanswered question. I honestly don't think we're anywhere closer. I think that there are neuroscientists. I know there are neuroscientists who assert that we are much closer, but I'm not among that group.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's amazing that we can do that and how little we know about it. And is that one of the big questions for the next generation?
Yeah, no, I think it's quite possible to make a lot of progress on lots of things that can help reduce human suffering without answering that question. And so, while I acknowledge that that is still a really central question, it's also not something, honestly, that keeps me up at night and prevents me from doing other things, because I'm very much motivated by, uh, uh, a passage that is very important to the Dalai Lama. It's also important to me. I read it every day. It's sitting in front of my screen at home. And it's a quote from Shantideva, basically saying that as long as suffering exists, I will work to dispel the misery of the world. And that's a very practical kind of mission that I feel, deeply in my bones, and really is what I dedicate my work to. And so I think we can help reduce suffering without necessarily answering that question. I think it would be great to answer that question, and I'd love conversations and any serious efforts that might further it along, but I'm not stuck, trying to answer that question to the exclusion of working to help relieve suffering.
Yeah. 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 Even maybe bring it down to something, a question that just came in around relieving suffering. The question is if you could give one piece of advice to a new practitioner, a new mindfulness practitioner, what would that be? I know
Uh,
that's shifting gears a fair bit from where we just were, so it might take a moment to shift your gear over that way, but it's something that I suspect a lot of people would be appreciative of your thoughts on.
yeah, well, first, let me just have a few disclaimers. am not a mindfulness teacher. And so I'm sure that there are many more qualified people that you've had on this talk series who are more well qualified than I am to answer that question. But if I'm pushed to give a response, uh, I would say a few things. One is it's really important not to fight with your mind and to instead make friends with your mind. That's something that's taken me a long time to learn. And so, I've seen mindfulness practitioners in the early stage of their practice, really saying, oh, I've, got to sit for an hour and really calm my mind, get rid of my thoughts. And, that's a kind of stance of fighting with your mind. It's just not going to work. And so I think having an attitude of friendliness and also an attitude of curiosity is really helpful. And then the other thing I would say is that, one of the things that Mingyur Rinpoche often says is that the road to Lhasa goes up and down. And what he means by that is, there are days when you have a crappy meditation session, but that might be actually as important, if not more important, than a session that's, quote, good. And so don't get discouraged. It's all part of the path.
Yeah. Yes, even thinking like another question that came in is more for folks that are neurodivergent. And so that asks, how does mindfulness benefit neurodivergent individuals such as those with ADHD? And are there specific practices that work well for students or professionals with these experiences? And I know you're trained as a psychologist. I'm not sure how much you really explored into those areas, but this is actually, these kinds of questions have come up fairly regularly, including in prior talks as well. So if you
Yeah,
had,
so I would say, another thing that I've learned both from scientific research as well as from my own practice is that short periods of practice that are interspersed throughout the day often are more helpful than trying to do one long period of practice. And so, um, just to give one example, and this is a very practical question that we don't know the answer to. If a person allocates and say they're going to meditate 20 minutes a day, is it better for them to meditate in a single 20-minute session, in two 10-minute sessions, or maybe in 10 2-minute sessions, or even in 21-minute sessions that are sprinkled throughout the day? We have no friggin' idea. And I would say that the answer is likely to be different for different kinds of people. And so I would say to a person with ADHD, maybe you should meditate for 2 minutes 5 times a day, and start with that. And also, if you fidget a lot, if you're uncomfortable, don't meditate while you're sitting. Meditate while you're walking. Meditate while you're doing other things. You can meditate anywhere, anytime. There's nothing special about, there's no requirement that has you meditating only while you're sitting.
yeah, thanks. Yeah,
And I
so
think that, some of these issues have not been scientifically explored very rigorously, but this is an area that I think really does need serious attention. What kind of dosing strategy, if you will, is most efficacious for which kinds of people?
Yeah. Yeah, my PhD is in pharmacology and therapeutics. So I did dosing studies during my PhD, and I've been amazed at the lack of dosing studies in the mindfulness arena. And so what
Wow.
is the minimally effective dose? Sometimes we have like the 8-week programs that people often want shorter. We've actually been testing one that's longer, called MBSR2, and finding sizable benefits with an even higher dose. And so I think that's a real open question right now around what is the optimal dose for each individual and what they're working with.
Yeah, that's great. And
Um,
find some, real benefit with really short practice that is maintained consistently for at least um, a month.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Thich Nhat Hanh used to talk about how if mindfulness meditation isn't enjoyable, we want to consider whether we want to do it or not. And so it's sort of the idea when we practice, piano, we get better at piano, but if we have to practice so much that we start to hate it, we're going to quit. And so how do we find that optimal amount of practice that's actually making our lives better and enjoyable, but not so much that we start to dislike it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I know we're starting to come towards the end. One question that came in is that's also related to our closing question that we're asking all the speakers. So someone shared, I'm curious about the ethics of mindfulness, especially in today's social climate. How can mindfulness inform activism and social engagement without becoming a tool for complacency? Where do acceptance and action meet?
Yeah, critical question. We think about that, I would say at least once a day, often more. And what I would say is that it's really a delicate balance and requires a kind of nuanced threading the needle, if you will. Every human being, even in the most horrific circumstances, has the capacity to, I think, increase their well-being. On the other hand, we know that various kinds of social conditions dramatically impact our capacity to flourish. And I think that also it's the case that if we wish to engage in actions to promote systemic change, we need a certain kind of vitality to do that. And so I think it's really important uh, to cultivate well-being in the interest of social action, because one of the um, sectors that is showing the highest level of burnout is among people who are social activists. And so I think that there um, a couple of things. One is that mindfulness and other related contemplative practices emerged in a context that is, you can think of it as an ethical framework. This is really what Buddhists call the view. And in some uh, um, applications of mindfulness in the West and other contemplative practices, I think we have lost the ethical context, or at least it's been watered down. And I am a big advocate for strengthening it. And I think strengthening it will help to keep it in balance, and will help to mitigate against the concern that this person who's asking the question is concerned about, which I think is a legitimate concern about just sort of fostering complacency uh, in in environments that are inhospitable, inhumane in various ways. We don't want to do that. And so I think that um, reminding people of this ethical framework is really important to help direct these skills in a way that would improve our collective well-being.
Yeah, thank you. Good. I think maybe just briefly, we're almost out of time, but looking ahead to the future, where do you see the study and practice of mindfulness best serving humanity?
Well, as I said when I began, I think one of the important things that we need to do is go beyond mindfulness, with all due respect. I think mindfulness is really important and a critical ingredient, but it's not the only ingredient. So let's broaden it to include all the skills we need to flourish. I think that our vision is really working sector by sector, and ideally with multiple sectors simultaneously. So we know, and our center has worked with individual sectors. We've worked with healthcare providers, we've worked with educators, we've worked with first responders, we've worked with government officials, we've worked with employees in the workplace. Can we envision a flourishing city, for example, where we work with all these sectors simultaneously? And we can actually then document the impact of a large majority of the population engaging in these practices in a way that may make a difference on distal outcomes that matter. An example of a distal outcome that matters in a city may be crime rate, or healthcare costs, or suicide rate. Those are all distal outcomes that I actually think can move if a sufficiently large percentage of the population is engaged. And one of the messages that comes from our work and the work of many others is, while it's also true that the more you practice, and our data suggests this too, the likely will be more beneficial outcome. It's also true that even short amounts of practice, if they're done on a consistent basis, can make a real difference. And so it doesn't take much to get these networks started. And once they start, once change is occurring in the positive direction, people can taste the benefit and will be motivated to do more. And so I think we need to think about this on a large scale and collect the kind of evidence that I think will really enable us to cross the tipping point, so that it would be penny wise and pound foolish not to incorporate this in city planning, for example. Those are the goals that we're seeking to work toward in the future.
Oh, thank you. Well, we've got to come to a closer at time now, but just want to thank you for really your career's contributions to the field. I think you really are a light in the contemplative studies field, and also for scientists, and more broadly than that. So really appreciate you coming today and sharing your wisdom with us, and continuing to do so year by year. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for the Center at Brown. And I really relish the opportunity to talk with you. So this was great, and I look forward to more.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thank you very much. Fran, any last words from you?
Yeah, no,
Or
just thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dr. Davidson. And as promised, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording. I know some folks joined late. And then Dr. Davidson, I'll follow up with you. We had several individuals ask for the names of some of the mentors and individuals that inspired you. So we can provide a list of references in that email that we send out. So thank
Okay.
you again for joining us today, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.
thanks. Bye.
Bye.